We all know that image. The brooding vampires standing under neon lights, flawless skin, perfect hair, a creature of elegance and irresistible charm. Maybe you've seen them in blockbuster movies, K-dramas, anime, or the latest romance series where immortality looks almost desirable. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about vampires, the seduction, the beauty, the power, is a lie polished by centuries of storytelling? Because the first vampire, the real vampire, was nothing like this. Imagine peeling back the glossy layers of pop culture, pulling down the velvet curtains of gothic castles, and stepping into a world far older, far colder, and far more terrifying. A world where the creature we now romanticize was once a nightmare, whispered only in fear. The Slavic vampir, the original vampir, is not a tragic noble or a tortured anti-hero. It is something far more primal, far more disturbing, and far more human than you ever imagined. Long before Dracula took his first fictional breath, long before the word vampire even reached Western ears, the Slavs spoke of beings that rose not for love, but for hunger. In the ancient Slavic world, the undead were born from the soil and from the brutal realities of life itself. Winters were merciless, disease was unpredictable, death felt close enough to breathe on your neck. And burial rites, every knot, every nail, every handful of earth were sacred shields meant to protect the living from whatever might claw its way back. One mistake, even an innocent one, could doom an entire village. And so the names vampir and vampir were not entertainment. They were warnings carried on the wind. These early vampires weren't pale aristocrats with hypnotic eyes. They were swollen, bloated, ruddy-skinned and distended with the blood they stole from neighbors, livestock, even kin. Not beautiful, but grotesque. They didn't glide through moonlit forests like graceful shadows. They dragged themselves from shallow graves, leaving claw marks in the soil and carrying the reek of rot like a second skin. To the early Slavs, the vampire wasn't just a monster. It was a reason, a desperate explanation for the things no one understood. The sudden fever that devoured a family overnight, the cattle found drained and lifeless, the crushing weight that pinned a sleeper to their bed, that eerie sensation of being watched by something that should have stayed dead. This is where the legend truly begins. Not with capes or castles, but with fear, ancient human fear, and a creature born from the earth, the cold, and our deepest dread of what might rise when the grave cannot hold it. This is the real beginning of the vampire. Darker, older, and far more horrifying than anything we've been taught to imagine.
To understand the first vampires, we must journey east, into the forests, marshes, and frozen plains, where the early Slavic peoples carved out their lives beneath a sky that offered little mercy. In this world, death was never distant. A single winter could erase entire families. A sudden fever could empty a village in days. And with so much loss, the boundary between the living and the dead felt dangerously thin. The Slavs believed that the afterlife was not a clean break, not a peaceful departure into light, but a fragile transition that could be corrupted, disturbed, or broken altogether. And when that boundary fractured, something could return. They called it vampir or vampire, not a graceful creature of shadows, but a reanimated corpse, swollen with decay and heavy with the stench of the grave. A being that carried pestilence in its breath, sickness in its shadow, and death in every step it took. These beliefs were not born from fantasy. They rose from centuries of hardship, an age without medicine, without explanations, without hope, in the face of the unknown. When a child died suddenly, when livestock wasted away, when a body looked strangely intact days after burial, people searched desperately for answers. And the answers they found were often terrifying. Some individuals, they believed, were marked for unrest from the moment they entered the world. Those born with unusual features, those who died by violence or misfortune, those who violated sacred customs, those whose bodies were neglected or improperly mourned. These were not simply tragic cases, they were warnings, harbingers of the restless dead. To the early Slavs, these signs were not myth or metaphor. They were a system, a grim logic born from fear, survival, and the fragile hope that understanding the rules of the dead might protect the living. Unlike the later legends that fixate on fangs and the taste of blood, the hunger of the early Slavic vampire was something far more complex and infinitely more terrifying. Blood was only the beginning. The vampire was believed to feed on the very essence of the living. It drained life energy itself, leaving victims pale, exhausted, and hollow-eyed, as if the warmth had been pulled from their bones during the night. It brought sickness and fever wherever it wandered, afflicting entire households with sudden, mysterious illness that no healer could explain. Livestock, so vital to village survival, were found strangled or collapsed in their stalls, as though squeezed by an invisible weight. Milk soured overnight, food spoiled without reason, and crops withered, all blamed on the unseen presence of a hungry corpse. Worst of all, the vampire was said to return to torment its own family, visiting widows, children, and relatives first, as if still tied to old emotions, twisted into something predatory. To the old Slavs, blood was merely one form of nourishment. What the vampire truly craved was life itself, your breath, your warmth, your vitality, the spark that made you human. Some tales describe the vampire as a shadowy figure slipping into homes at night, settling upon the chest of a sleeping victim and crushing the breath from their lungs, a haunting image that echoes today in what we call sleep paralysis. Other stories portray it as fully corporeal, a body that moved among the living with uncanny familiarity. A dead husband knocking at the door. A deceased neighbor seen walking through the village square. A relative sitting at the table at dusk, speaking in a voice everyone recognized, until hunger tightened its grip. Again and again, villagers across the Slavic world shared the same chilling testimonies. People swore they had spoken to a dead family member, believing them alive until daylight revealed the truth. They found fresh footprints, human footprints, leading away from a grave. And they watched livestock weaken, their strength drained as though something had fed upon them during the dark, moonless hours. To these communities, the vampire wasn't an invention of imagination. It wasn't a symbol, nor a metaphor, nor a campfire story meant to entertain. It was a presence, unseen, relentless, and horrifyingly real. This creature wasn't fantasy. It was the most feared reality they could imagine, a nightmare that walked in familiar skin. If the hunger of the vampir terrified the Slavic people, there's one fear greater still, the fear that no grave could hold it. To the ancient Slavs, death was not the end of danger. It was the beginning. Because once a person died, their body became a threshold, a fragile doorway between the living and whatever lurked beyond. And if that doorway failed to close, something corrupted could step back through. So the villagers fought back the only way they knew how, through ritual. These were not gentle memorials or symbolic farewells. They were defensive acts, desperate, urgent measures meant to restrain the dead before they ever had the chance to rise. One of the most common protections was to place stones, coins, or shards of pottery inside the mouth of the deceased. To the villagers, this sealed the body, preventing the corpse from feeding again, locking hunger behind cold, silent teeth. Other methods were far more brutal. Contrary to later legends, the stake was not driven through the heart. It was hammered through the abdomen, the center of the body, pinning the corpse to the earth like an animal trap. The message was clear: you belong to the soil, do not return. Some bodies were decapitated, their heads placed between their feet or beneath their arms, ensuring that even if the corpse awakened, it could not find its own face. Others were bound with iron shackles, for iron was believed to break unclean magic and sap the strength of evil spirits. And then there were the quieter rituals, those that required no violence, only patience and belief. Around certain graves, villagers scattered poppy seeds, thousands of them, trusting the ancient idea that the undead were cursed with an obsessive need to count. If the vampir tried to escape, it would be trapped by its own compulsion, forced to tally every seed until sunrise burned it back into stillness. Garlic, too, was a powerful guardian, not for its smell, but for its purity. It was planted around graves, hung in windows, rubbed onto doors, a living plant used to repel the dead. These rituals may sound strange, even absurd today, but to the people who performed them, they were acts of survival. With no doctors, no science, no understanding of disease or decomposition, terror became tradition, and ritual became the only shield against a world they could not explain. Because when a village believed the undead walked among them, fear became contagious. Entire communities would gather in trembling circles, sharing rumors in hushed voices, staring at fresh graves as though watching for movement. Every ritual was a plea. Every burial, a battle. These were not the actions of ignorant people. They were the actions of people who had seen too much death and needed to believe they could stop it from rising again. For centuries, the vampire existed in the shadows of the Slavic East. A creature feared in forests and borderland villages, kept at bay through rituals older than memory itself. Its world was isolated, rural, fragile. But isolation never lasts. As Europe shifted, through migration, trade, war, and cultural exchange, stories began to travel with the people who carried them. And among those stories was one that clung like a cold breath on the wind. The tale of the Ooper, the restless dead. These early whispers reached neighboring cultures first. Germanic settlers, Balkan travelers, and Ottoman chroniclers encountered Slavic villages where the boundary between life and death was watched with utter dread. They brought these stories westward, retelling them in new tongues, filtering them through their own fears, their own folklore. With every retelling, the legend adapted, absorbing elements of local myth, shifting shape but never losing its Slavic core, the corpse that refused to remain at rest. But then came the moment that changed everything. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, the vampire did something no one expected. It went public. Across Eastern Europe, reports of suspected vampiric attacks burst into official records with terrifying intensity. These were not tales swapped over firelight, they were documents, signed and stamped by military officers, priests, surgeons, and imperial administrators. Villages claimed their dead were rising, livestock died in unnatural numbers, entire families fell sick within days. And when graves were opened, the bodies inside appeared horrifyingly fresh, ruddy-cheeked, swollen with blood, their nails long, their hair seeming to have grown. These incidents ignited what historians now call the vampire epidemics. The Austrian Empire dispatched officers to investigate. Doctors were ordered to examine corpses. Priests conducted exorcisms. Entire communities demanded exhumations, convinced that they were fighting not disease, but something hungrier. Western Europe was riveted. Missionaries, scholars, diplomats, and traveling writers journeyed into Slavic regions, driven by a mix of skepticism and morbid curiosity. And when they returned, they carried with them stories Europe had never heard before, graves filled with liquid blood, bodies that appeared warm to the touch, villagers performing midnight rituals to keep the undead from walking. Reports of recently deceased persons who rise to torment the living, written in the solemn tone of official inquiry. These accounts struck the Western imagination like lightning. Newspapers across London, Paris, and Vienna printed breathless reports. Universities debated the phenomenon. Religious scholars argued whether vampires were demons, revenants, or signs of moral decay. Royal courts demanded explanations. Pamphlets, essays, and travelogues spread the Slavic word vampire, its letters cold and strange, across the entire continent. For the first time in history, Europe wasn't just frightened, it was obsessed. The vampire had slipped its provincial grave. It no longer belonged to isolated villages or crumbling borderlands, but become a matter of science, theology, medicine, law, and cultural fascination. It had migrated, not by foot but through stories. Not through forests, but through ink. Not as a monster, but as an idea. And that idea was unstoppable. From this moment forward, the vampire would never again be confined to the Slavic wilderness. It had crossed Europe, and soon it would remake the world's entire understanding of horror. By the 19th century, something remarkable and completely unexpected began to happen. The vampire, once a grotesque corpse crawling out of shallow graves in Slavic villages, started to evolve. Writers across Europe became fascinated by the dark charm of the Eastern legends. But instead of portraying the vampire as a bloated, blood-swollen peasant, they reimagined it as something far more alluring, something far more dangerous. The transformation began with John Polidori, whose groundbreaking tale The Vampire introduced the world to a new kind of predator. A vampire who wore fine clothing, spoke with elegance, and moved through aristocratic society with cold, predatory grace. Polidori's vampire didn't stumble from a grave. He stepped into drawing rooms, he seduced, he deceived, he killed with charm as much as with hunger. Then, Sheridan Le Fanu reshaped the myth again with Carmilla, adding layers of intimacy, sensuality, and psychological depth. His vampire didn't simply drain life, she manipulated emotions, trust, and desire. The monster had learned not just to stalk its victims, but to enchant them. And then came the figure who would redefine the vampire forever: Count Dracula. Bram Stoker drew from Slavic folklore, from Romanian legends, from the anxieties of the Victorian era, and from Western fantasies of the exotic East. Dracula was both ancient and modern, noble and monstrous, a being who carried centuries of darkness behind a polite smile. He crossed oceans, infiltrated cities, and commanded legions of nightmares. He was a relic of the past, yet a symbol of the fears and desires of his age. The vampire had completed its transformation. No longer a rotting villager, it had become a symbol of forbidden desire, an immortal figure whose beauty concealed its brutality. It represented the allure of eternal youth, the seduction of power, and the intoxicating pull of mystery. The vampire now walked among the living as a charming aristocrat, a creature who could blend into society instead of lurking outside it. But beneath the polished exterior, one truth never changed. This elegant predator, this suave, velvet-draped immortal who haunted the pages of Western literature, still carried the bones of its Slavic ancestor. It was still, at its core, a corpse that once crawled from its grave in the dead of night, hungry, grotesque, and unholy. A creature born from fear long before it ever became fantasy. Today, the vampire stands everywhere, an immortal silhouette cast across the world's screens and stories. From Hollywood blockbusters to Korean dramas, from gothic novels to open-world video games, this creature has slipped into every culture, every medium, every imagination. It prowls through teenage romances, stalks survival horror games, whispers through dark fantasy epics, and even shines, sometimes literally, in modern reinterpretations. Yet no matter how glamorous, tragic, or heroic these modern vampires become, their pulse still beats in an ancient rhythm. Their heart, their blood, their very shadow, still flows from a place far older and far darker than the bright lights of cinema. Behind every immortal lover and brooding anti-hero lies the outline of something much more primitive: the vampire of the Slavic wilderness. A creature born not from castles and capes, but from muddy graves, freezing forests, and terrified villagers who whispered warnings by firelight. The modern vampire may wear designer clothes, speak with charm, or contemplate eternity with a poet's melancholy, but its bones are old. Its hunger is ancient. Its origin is the cold, moonlit soil where peasants once believed the dead clawed their way back to the living. Because legends change, skins are shed, stories shift with each generation, but fears endure, and the vampire endures with them. But the question remains: why does this creature follow us into every era? Why in December 2025, with satellites above us and AI in our pockets, does the vampire still feel alive? Perhaps it is because vampires embody the fears we cannot name but cannot escape. They carry our dread of death, the terror that the grave is not a peaceful ending but a restless transition. They echo our fear of disease, that something unseen might drain our strength, our life, our humanity. They reflect our anxiety toward the shadows within ourselves, the hunger for power, desire, temptation, or immortality that we pretend we do not have. The vampire is a mirror we cannot break, no matter how modern we become. It represents the danger of desire, the seduction of darkness, the question of what we might become if we surrendered to our most primal instincts. Even now, in stories across the world, the vampire watches us from the edges of mythology and metaphor, changing with us, evolving with us, adapting to our newest fears. It is a creature of death that refuses to die. And so we return to it again and again, not because we crave its bite, but because we recognize its shadow. Because in the end, the vampire is not only a monster in the dark, it is the part of ourselves we fear the most, the question we hesitate to ask, the darkness we carry within. And as long as humanity fears those things, the vampire will live on. So perhaps the only question left is this: when we stare at the vampire, at its hunger, its immortality, its shadow, are we seeing a monster or are we seeing ourselves?
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.